Sita's education. Sita's presence transformed the household. Everything now revolved around her. Janak Baba and Sunaina Ma would spend hours sitting in her presence, watching her sleep, taking turns, holding her. I had never seen our Baba like this, and we were all surprised that anything in the material world could so transfix him. Our Baba, who had transcended all attachments, but they were not the only ones who were mesmerized by her. This was a condition that came of all of us in the household. If something was needed for the infant, all the servants would rush to bring it. I would have a hard time leaving the room where she lay. Such was the attraction to her. I would find myself gazing upon her, and for the first time in my life, palpable love entered my heart. I felt for this child as I had never felt for anyone. There were no words to describe that feeling. Mata, I whispered one day when I found myself alone with her. It is through you that I have come to know joy. You have brought light into my life, and I will serve you faithfully to the best of my ability for the rest of my days. From the beginning, the servants and others called her Mata. It just came naturally. Although outwardly we were the ones caring for her, we sensed that inwardly she was caring for us. In the truest sense, she was our Mata. Sunainama laughed at first when she heard us calling her Mata, but then her laughter subsided and she said, "You're all correct. Although she's a mother of the world, I must see her as my child. That is the nature of Maya, illusion." For several months after Sita's arrival, Janak Baba did not leave the palace except to visit the immediate localities. His habitual travel to distant sages paused, for a while at least. But as Sita approached the first year of her birth, he accepted an invitation to visit a certain sage. He came to say goodbye to Sita. I was there with Sunaina Ma. As he explained to Sita where he was going, Sunaina Ma looked at me with a smile, amused that Janak Baba would speak to the infant as if she were fully grown. But as he rose to take his leave, Sita held out her arms to him and their eyes locked. For a moment, he didn't say anything or move. But then, as if in response to her, he said, "Okay, I will take you along." Sunaina Ma began to protest, but Janak Baba simply put his fingers to her lips. "She has asked to come, and I cannot refuse her. You cannot care for her alone. I am perfectly able to, and I am sure the Hermitage will be happy to receive her. If you insist on taking her, then bring Meenakshi and Usha with you." Usha was a younger servant and had great devotion to the household. She often assisted me in my work. Janak Baba looked at me. "Yes, Meenakshi, you may come and go tell Usha as well." I had never traveled away from the palace, and I had never visited a sage's hermitage. This would be a totally new experience for me. It took us all day to reach the hermitage, but this was due to the many stops we made. The Maharaja used such trips as an occasion to visit the villages and speak with the people, who always insisted on offering him a meal, and he would not refuse them. This was the first time for them to meet Rajakumari, Princess Sita. As word spread that the Maharaja was passing through, accompanied by his daughter, people came from many villages to greet them. I was amazed at how open and receptive Janak Baba was to the crowds that gathered. He did not seem to mind in the least the many attempts to touch and hold her, and Sita was all smiles and giggles. When we finally arrived at the hermitage, the sage seemed not at all surprised that we had baby Sita with us. "I was expecting you," he said to her, "and I'm glad you have come for your first lessons." The sage took Janak Baba into his hut while I went to the hut assigned to Sita, Usha, and me. It had been a long journey, and I was sure that Sita would be ready for bed, as she had stayed awake throughout the whole journey. Usha and I quickly prepared the bedding for her, and then Usha laid her down and reclined beside her. I began to sing quietly. When I looked over, she was fast asleep, but I kept humming until I also began to nod off. Sometime later, I awoke with a start. I was slumped over the bed where Sita was sleeping, or had been. I saw that the bed was now empty, except for Usha, who was fast asleep. Mata, I called out several times. She was not in the hut. My cry woke Usha, and the two of us went outside in a state of near panic. It was late in the night. Sita could not have gone far, I reasoned. I searched the whole courtyard, but she was nowhere to be found. A faint light illuminated the hut where Janak Baba and the sage had been sitting. I would have to go alert them, hesitant to disturb them, but not knowing what else to do. I told Usha to keep searching while I approached the hut. The door was slightly ajar, and I saw Janak Baba and the sage and a few others sitting deep in meditation. What was I to do? As I stood there, trembling in fear, Janak Baba slowly opened his eyes and motioned to a corner of the room. There, I found the sleeping Sita. He said, in not more than a whisper, "She walked in not long ago. She walked in." In his whispering voice, I could hear his amazement, as baby Sita had not taken her first step as of yet. Surely I had misheard him. Walked? I asked. He nodded. "Leave her here and go back to bed, Meenakshi. Everything is fine." From that night on, Sita walked everywhere. She was so pleased with her new capability that she would not sit still. She would take off before I realized it, and I had a hard time keeping up with her. She had her eye on the hermitage gate. Whenever it opened, she hastened towards it. The forest lay beyond, and at a certain moment, I realized that this was where she wanted to go. The day before we were scheduled to depart, Sita managed to escape my watchful eye and slip out the open gate. I rushed after her, but Janak Baba stopped me. "Let her explore," he said. "Clearly, she needs to go there. She has been looking in that direction these last few days." "Maharaja, shouldn't I follow?" He nodded. "But at a distance. Give her the room she needs." I called Usha, and the two of us followed her. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. Without any hesitation, she went into the forest, where she lifted into her arms a small animal that had been wounded and was hiding behind a tree. Then she turned around and, with the animal in hand, returned to the hermitage with Usha and me some yards behind. She handed the animal to her father, who had been waiting for her return, and began to cry. Janak Baba understood immediately. "We will help this little animal," he said gently to her. She shook her head, the tears still flowing. A number of the hermitage residents, hearing a commotion, came out to see what was wrong. They made a little bed for the animal and bandaged its broken leg, but the animal died in the night. Sita was quiet after that. She was no longer interested in the gate or in leaving the hermitage. She stayed by her father's side, and soon it was time to depart. We had been gone but a week, but when Sunainama saw us, she said it seemed a year had passed because Sita had grown so and was now walking, and the experience with the little animal seemed to have affected her. She left as an infant but returned a child. Sita now accompanied Janak Baba on many of his visits to the sages. He always took a few of the servants, but I didn't often have the opportunity to accompany them. The servants returned with stories of Sita's interaction with the hermitage students or with the animals in the nearby forest, and we all took great pleasure in their accounts as they made us feel as if we had been there ourselves. On such occasions, we would gather around in the kitchen after the day's work was done, and the servant who had gone on the journey would share a story of Mata Sita. We would laugh with delight as we all had come to feel as if she were our own. Some years later, Janak Baba announced that he was going back to see the sage that he had visited with Sita on her first journey from the palace. She was eager to go, I didn't expect to be asked to accompany them, and so was surprised when Sunainama asked me to go along. Soon after we arrived, Sita asked her father to go to the forest where she had found the wounded animal. You remember that? He was surprised. She nodded. I saw the wounded animal while I was sleeping. That was how I knew where to go. Of course, you may go into the forest. You are free here to go wherever you wish. I accompanied her as she went deeper and deeper into the forest. She seemed to be looking for something. Finally, I said to her, Mata, I think we should turn back before we get lost. How can we get lost? She smiled. I have to find something before we return. What is it you're looking for? I don't know its name, but I will know it when I see it. I feel it calling me. Mata, is this some game? She shook her head. Not at all. It is a very serious matter. Please have patience, Meenakshi. I know I will find it. I hear it calling. Is it an animal? I asked. She shook her head. I couldn't understand what she was talking about, but this was often the case with Sita. I followed as she wound her way through the overgrown trails. We came upon some large birds. They seemed to be water birds, and Sita stopped in front of them. After a few minutes, I saw her fold her hands and thank them. Then, very consciously, she went to a nearby stream and started to dig out some roots. There, I have found it. Now we can return, she said simply, holding a large bunch of roots in her hand. I followed as she found the way back without any trouble. When we reached the hermitage, she went straight to the hut of the sage, who was explaining something to Janak Baba. I have brought these for you, she said to the sage, handing him the bunch of roots. Thank you, Sita, he said, with a confused look on his face. I am touched that you thought of me. What is this? Asked Janak Baba with a broad smile. What have you brought, Guruji? It is for his stomach, she said. This will help him. The confusion on the sage's face turned to shock. Stomach? Inquired Janak Baba. Then turning to the sage, he asked, Do you have stomach troubles? Indeed, I do. But how could you know this, Sita? Nobody but my wife is aware of this. She didn't answer, but instead advised him to boil the roots and drink the liquid, and his stomach troubles would improve. Amazing! Exclaimed the sage. I will certainly do as you advise. Janak Baba turned to me, his eye questioning to see whether I could provide any information. She seemed to know exactly what was needed, I said quietly. I followed her deep into the forest, and then she stopped to ask where the roots might be. Ask? Who did she ask? He pressed me. I didn't know how to respond and kept quiet. I turned to Sita. It was the birds who told you. Is that right, Sita? She nodded. They did direct me to the stream. Janak Baba and the sage looked at one another. Nobody spoke. Well, let's see how these roots work, said the sage finally with a small chuckle. For 3 days, his wife prepared the medicine, and then the sage approached Sita and confirmed that he was much, much better. My stomach is at ease after a long time, he said. You must show my wife where to find these roots so that I can continue to take this medicine. When we returned to the palace and Janak Baba relayed this story to Sunanama, she grew concerned. If word gets out, she said, people from throughout the kingdom will be coming for healing. But isn't that a good thing? Janak Baba asked. If she can help people? She is but a small child, protested Sunanama. Let her have her childhood at least. There will be time later. You are right, but we cannot contain her. Whatever she will do, she will do. And there is no way we can stop her. The following year, another incident occurred at a nearby hermitage. I had gone with Janak Baba to care for Sita while he was visiting a sage who had built a hermitage in the middle of the jungle. One evening, I looked around to see about putting Sita to bed when I found that she was gone. I searched everywhere but could not find her. Janak Baba was off meditating with the hermitage residents, and I hesitated to disturb him. She will come back soon, I told myself. But she didn't return. Hours later, I saw Janak Baba crossing the courtyard, returning to his hut. I had stayed awake, waiting for his return. I rushed out to catch him before he entered his hut. What is it, Meenakshi? He asked when he saw the fearful look on my face. Sita has been gone for hours. I don't know where she went, and I can't find her anywhere. She will return, he said. He replied assuredly. But it is very late and so dark tonight. I began to cry. I'm so sorry I let her out of my sight, I said between sobs. Meenakshi, we cannot confine her. I have said that again and again. She will return. Go to sleep. Janak Baba sat up through the night in meditation. I also sat up through the night, but not in meditation. I was too upset to sleep a wink. When I heard him leave his hut before dawn, I quickly went to follow, my heart pounding. I know where she is, he said quietly. Follow me. He walked some way into the jungle, and there he found her, sleeping beside a family of monkeys, her head resting on the lap of the mother monkey. We approached as quietly as we could, but when the mother monkey heard us, she let out a cry and quickly scampered up the nearby tree. The little ones followed her. Sita awoke with a start. Pitaji, she exclaimed. Without saying a word, he lifted her into his arms and carried her back into the hermitage. When he put her down in the courtyard, he looked at her with a serious expression. You should not have done or gone off without telling me, Meenakshi. She has been so worried that she didn't sleep at all night. She looked at me with regret in her eyes. What happened, Mata, that made you leave in the night? I asked. I was so worried when I couldn't find you. Sita was quiet. Then Janak Baba said, I know there was a good reason for you to leave, but why didn't you return? That mother monkey was sad, she said. One of her newborns had fallen from a tree and died. I felt her sorrow and couldn't help but go to her. When I found her whining, I put my head on her lap, and that seemed to ease her. Then I must have fallen asleep. I didn't mean to stay out all night. I understand, replied Janak Baba. But let us come to an agreement that you will always let one of us know where you are going so that there will be no cost worry. Sita nodded. I will try, but Pitaji, for a few more years, Sita, I have full faith that you can take care of yourself. But there are others who will worry, your mother especially. She would not have been happy had she been here. For the next few years, Sita was careful to let one of us know when she was wandering out. Every night, one of the servants would keep watch over Sita. Another one of us would come in the early morning to relieve the one who had been there through the night. Often we would sit outside the door. There was an incident a few years later that made us realize we could no longer keep such a close watch on her. I came early one morning and found the servant on guard that night fast asleep. Sita's bed was empty. She was nowhere to be found in the palace, so I searched the grounds. Something told me to go down to the river, where I found her. She was in the middle of a conversation with the river, and she seemed to be scolding it. I sat quietly nearby. Finally, she turned and saw me. Still in her scolding mode, she was not at all apologetic. What is it, Mata? I asked. What brought you down to the river so early in the morning? Last night, the river took the life of an ox. Now, what will that farmer do? How will he plow his fields? It was not right. How did you know this, Mata? I saw it in a dream, she said. It was as clear as could be. The ox had wandered off and came for a drink, but she swept the animal away. Now that farmer must be in a sorry state. It rained last night very heavily. Perhaps the ox slipped. Perhaps it wasn't the river's fault at all, I said, not quite knowing why I felt the need to defend the river. You may be right, Meenakshi, but still, we must help the farmer right now. When we returned to the palace, Sita told Janak Baba what had happened and insisted that they bring a new ox to the farmer. But how will we find this farmer? He asked with some amusement at her insistence. I will find him, she said. And so Janak Baba asked me to go to Kiran, who was in charge of the animals, and have him bring an ox. Kiran was an old time servant like myself. His father, like mine, had served in the household. He was known for his special care of all the animals, and Sita was very fond of him for this reason. She would often sit with him while he cared for one or the other of the animals, and she would tell him how to treat an animal if it took sick. I too liked to sit and watch him when I had the rare opportunity. He spoke to the animals as if they were his children, and I found that endearing. Kiran was a slight man, attractive in a certain way, more due to his manner than facial features. His complexion has a darkish hue, like mine, but I thought this due to the many hours he spent outside in the sun. There was a certain familiarity between us, both having been brought up in the household, although there was also a modesty, and the words between us were few. Kiran would do anything for Mata, and as soon as I told him about her dream, he brought one of our oxen to Janak Baba. He later told me what happened. Janak Baba, Sita, Kiran, and the ox made their way down to the riverside, asking one farmer after another if he had lost an ox in the night. None of them had. Sita, perhaps what you saw was only a dream, Janak Baba said after some time. It seems all the oxen are safe. No, she said with determination. I know it to be true. They trudged further down the river until at last they came to a farmer who was in a sorry state over the loss of his ox. His was a small plot of land, and he had but two oxen to help him plough his fields. The disappearance of one was a great loss indeed. When he saw the Maharaja bringing him a new ox, he was beside himself with gratitude. But the Maharaja would take no credit. It was Sita, he said, who insisted that we come. She saw that your ox had drowned in the river during the night. Take this animal as a gift from her. Later that day, I again found Sita by the riverside, but this time she was remorseful, not scolding. She had come to apologize to the river for her harsh tones. As I sat beside her, I saw a light rise from the river. It hovered over the water for a few minutes and then disappeared back into the depths. Sita seemed relieved by its appearance. Folding her hands, she murmured, I understand. What was that? I asked in astonishment. That was the river goddess. Did you see her beautiful form? No, Mata. I saw only a mist of light. She explained to me that death is a part of life and that she took the ox because it was his time to leave his body and take another. She said I should not mourn death because without death there is no birth. I am very sorry for the way I spoke to her. Mata, I am sure she understood that your heart was moved by the plight of the farmer. Yes, that is why she called me here, she said as she rose to leave. I will not question her again. It is true what she said about death, but this is a hard lesson, Mata. She turned to look at me. She was thoughtful for a few minutes and then asked, You were sad for a long time after your father died, weren't you, Meenakshi? She caught me off guard, and I didn't know how to respond. I nodded. But that was because you blamed yourself, wasn't it? How do you know that, Mata? I asked in surprise. She smiled. You still feel a little badly, but you shouldn't. You had nothing to do with his death. It was his time to go, and nothing could have prevented it. This conversation was a brief, very natural, matter of fact exchange of a few words, and yet it had a profound effect on me. Although I hardly thought of my father's death anymore, it was true that up until that moment I had not fully rid myself of guilt. Sitting in my room that night, I realized that Sita had quietly healed me of these feelings. A few months later, another incident occurred that reminded us all how keenly Mata felt the suffering endured by the natural world. Janak Baba had been invited to a new hermitage that was being built in the middle of a forest some hours away from Mithila. The hermitage was quite extensive and it was still expanding. Many of the sages from the region were also invited, and Janak Baba took Mata along. One of the servants relayed the story to us when she returned from the journey. After they arrived, Janak Baba was asked to join the gathering of sages to hear how the hermitages were growing in the region. Normally, Mata would join him, but this time she held back. She said she preferred to stay in the courtyard. Janak Baba was surprised, as she always loved to join the gatherings, but he didn't press her. For the next few days, she kept herself apart, and as the days passed, a feeling of sadness came over her, which became apparent to all. Finally, Janak Baba asked what the matter was. When she didn't respond, he asked again. Still, she didn't respond. Sita, I'm afraid you are being disrespectful of this hermitage by staying outside when it is known throughout the kingdom how much you enjoy being with the sages. It was rare for Janak Baba to criticize her. At his words, she looked up at him and apologized. I'm sorry, Pitaji, but it is they who have been disrespectful, and it is hard for me to overlook that. How so? He asked. How have they been disrespectful? They have made every effort to engage you and have treated you with the greatest honor. Come, she said, taking his hand. She led him into the forest and showed him all the trees that had been cut down, with only stumps remaining. They did not even ask permission. They just took what they wanted and thought nothing of how this would affect the other creatures. You have always taught me to be respectful of the forest, not to take more than is absolutely necessary. Janak Baba was dismayed by what he saw. You are right, Sita. We must find a solution to this. You have taught me, Pitaji, to give back double what one takes from nature and to always take with an attitude of gratitude. Yes, this is what I have taught you, and now you must teach these sages. Let us go speak with them. Janak Baba led her into the assembly. The sages were all seated, waiting for their Maharaja to come address them. Instead, he placed Sita in the position of honor and said, my daughter has been distressed since she arrived here, and I have only now found out the reason why. I will let her explain it to you. With those words, he seated himself in the back of the group. Sita looked around and was silent. Never before had she addressed any group of people, and she had a natural shyness, a modesty, and humility that were among her most attractive features. She could speak openly to her father and to those of us in the palace with whom she was familiar, but to address such an honorable group was new for her. Come, Sita, explain to them what you have just told me. Still, she was silent. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was not hers, not her soft, childish tone, but one that resonated with authority and conviction. I was very sad to see the disrespect here. The sage in charge of the hermitage looked greatly surprised and could not help but sputter as he stood with folded hands. Rajkumari Sita, if any of the hermitage residents have shown you disrespect, please forgive us. It was never intended. It is the forest that had been disrespected, and all the creatures that depend on the forest for life. You have taken so many trees without thinking of the consequences. This is not what Pitaji has taught me. He has taught me to be respectful of all life. And aren't trees life? Do they not give food and shelter to the forest creatures? Everyone in the assembly looked at one another, astonished at her words. But Sita, protested the head of the hermitage, we needed space and materials to build our hermitage. Isn't that also important? Have we forgotten that our ancestors were fed and nourished by the forest? And are we not taught to give gratitude for this? Sita's voice became firm, and yet the gentleness of her being flowed through her. Then what is the solution? Asked another of the sages. Advise us, Sita. Should we stop building and expanding our hermitages? Sita became thoughtful. No, that is not the solution. After a few minutes, her eyes lit up. Pitaji has taught me to give back double what we take from nature. And so, for every tree cut down, we should plant two. We must be very sure our needs are just, and we must explain our needs and ask permission of the forest before taking anything. If we fail to consider the life in the forest, ours will not be a prosperous future. That is certain. Murmuring could be heard throughout the assembly, and many heads nodded in agreement. Yes, yes, this is a very good solution, said the hermitage head. We will implement this at once. Janak Baba, who had been silent as he observed the dialogue, now stood up and said, all of the kingdom of Videha will implement this decision so that our young people will learn to preserve the forest and animals and plants that took care of our ancestors. Turning to Sita, he added, there is a solution to every problem. You must always seek a way to resolve differences and to reconcile opposing needs. After returning to the palace, Janak Baba described a scene to Sunainama. I was in the room assisting her and overheard their discussion. Sunainama glowed with pride when she heard what Sita had done. We have no need to worry now about who will rule the kingdom. Sita is more than fit to take your place one day. The people will be overjoyed to see her installed. Janak Baba shook his head. As much as I have tried, I cannot see Sita's future. It is as if that vision is blocked to me. But I do know, Sunaina, that she is not destined to rule this kingdom or any other or to remain in Mithila. You must not have that notion. She has not come to us for that. Yet, I do know that she will serve the world. We are here to give her training she needs for that work. This episode was the first indication of Sita's transition from childhood. Despite her young years, she was beginning to find her own voice, and she was now to take greater interest not just in visiting the hermitages or wandering into the forest, but also in sitting, listening, and responding to the teachings of the sages. A year or so later, another story reached the servants, one that we didn't quite understand, but that made us all smile. Sita accompanied Janak Baba to visit one of the great sages of the region, who had taught the Maharaja certain sacred mantras. One evening, when the sage was explaining the meaning of each sound of a particular mantra, Sita interrupted and asked, is it not enough simply to think the words? Why must one recite them out loud? Sounds are vibrations, Sita, he explained. They affect other vibrations and can bring the desired changes in the external world if the sounds are pronounced correctly. Each sound is attuned to a particular vibration in the universe, and a slight mispronunciation can alter the effect tremendously. Sita was quiet for a few minutes and then asked, but aren't thoughts also vibrations? Can't thoughts also have an effect? Indeed, they do, he explained. But sound is more powerful than thought. That is why the recitation of a mantra is used to bring about an effect. Just thinking the mantra will not have the same outcome. Sita thought for a minute and then responded. But could that be due to the power of one's concentration? If the mind's focus is such, would not a thought have the same effect? Sita is right, sounded a voice from the doorway. The power of thought cannot be disputed. Everyone turned to see who had interjected themselves into the discussion. A kindly looking middle aged woman stood in the doorway, dressed in renunciate clothing. Her dark hair, streaked with strands of grey, was swept up atop her head. Her skin was clear with no wrinkles. Her eyes were dark and intense, but also gentle. The other sages greeted her. Sage Gargi, welcome. Please come in and join us. Gargi was a great philosopher and expounder of the Vedas, renowned in Janak Baba's kingdom. Sage Gargi entered the room and took her seat beside Sita. Sita, we live on the physical plane. In the higher realms, thought alone can manifest what one desires. Here, in the material world, a denser vibration is needed. The physical world came into manifestation through the vibration of sound, through the Om vibration. And these wise men are correct. Pronunciation is key. It is very difficult to align oneself with the correct vibration. If one's thought is not attuned, the sound will not be perfectly aligned. Thought guides the sound. A pure mind is needed, or at least a very disciplined mind, which is why so few hold the power of mantra. In earlier times, mantra was used to bring benefit to the earth, to bring the rains when they failed to come, for example. She stopped for a moment. I see, Sita, that you have a question. Sita didn't respond, but her expression showed she was taking in what she had just heard. Come, ask anything, pressed Sage Karki. These are important points for you to know. They will be valuable to you later on. Sita turned to look at the small group that had gathered, a few of whom she knew to be advanced in meditation practices. There was a long drought in Videha before I was born. Why didn't mantras bring the rains then? She asked. They looked at one another without responding. Sita turned to Sage Karki and asked again, why didn't the mantras help when the people and the animals were suffering from lack of water? Sage Kargi responded in a low voice. A powerful being, Sita, can counter the mantras and make them ineffective. This is rare, but it has happened and did happen then. Who would do such a thing? She asked in amazement. And who would have such power? Again there was silence. No one dared to speak his name. Sita looked from one to another. Finally, Maharaja Janak intervened and said to Sita, it is getting late. Perhaps it is time for us to retire. Pitaji, I must know who is the cause of such suffering and why. His name is Ravana, replied Sage Kargi quietly. He was once a highly respected scholar and a great devotee of Mahadev, Lord Shiva, and through long and intense tapasya gained many powers. His mother is a powerful asura of a demon race, but his father is a respected scholar of the Vedas. He could have followed either path, but arrogance and pride overtook him and he sought to conquer the three worlds. He is one of those rare beings who can counter the mantras. He has subdued many parts of the earth and has mastered many forms of subterfuge. But he will not touch Videha now. The sages are safe here. Sita looked troubled, but she saw her father rise, indicating it was time to end the conversation. She pranamed to the sages and retired with him. The next day they left the hermitage. Sita was quiet the whole way back to the palace. Finally, her father said, Sita, do not trouble yourself about what you heard. It is not for you to worry about that now. I'm not worried, Pitaji. I'm just trying to understand why someone with knowledge, a devotee of Mahadev, would do harm. He was not ready to handle the power he attained. Power in the wrong hands, Sita, can do great damage. Changing the subject, he said, I see how much you admire Sage Gargi. Would you like to study with her? Very much, Sita replied with an eager smile. Then it shall be arranged. A few years later, I received a great blessing from Sita. Usha and I were sitting in the garden one day, watching Mata play with a family of rabbits that often came out of their hideaway to greet her. I was looking at Mata, thinking how beautiful she was now that she was approaching womanhood. She had always been a pretty child with a clear complexion and eyes that sparkled with life. But her form was changing, and she was becoming strikingly beautiful. As she played with the animals, her long, thick hair, dark as a moonless sky, cascaded to her waist and flowed in wavelets over her arms and over the body of a small rabbit she now held close to her chest. Her body was slender and graceful, so light that she can barely seem to touch the earth when she walked. Her large almond shaped eyes matched the color of her hair and shone with joy. As she has progressed from childhood to womanhood, her eyes had grown deeper, like pools that had no bottom, and they reflected not only the joy that was her being, but also a knowledge, a wisdom, and a deep calm that affected us all. When she looked at you, you knew that she was seeing more than your outer form. She was gazing deep into the inner recesses of your being so that she could alleviate any worry or cause for pain. This was her manner. Her complexion was a few shades lighter than mine and emitted a soft golden hue. Her face, though slender, had a fullness to it and bore no imperfections, no marks. I could not imagine a more beautiful person. As I was admiring her beauty, Mata suddenly laid the rabbit on the ground and came over to me, seated herself beside me, said in a quiet tone, Meenakshi, you shouldn't feel that your father did not love you. He loved you a great deal. Love is expressed not only by words, but also by actions. Caught completely off guard, I was taken aback by her words and didn't know how to respond. Don't you remember when he would sit by your bed at night and watch until you fell asleep? That was a sign of his love. And when he would bring you along at night to receive Pitaji's blessing before going to bed, that was also a sign of his love. She spoke as if she had been there with me, witnessing these small acts of caring, of which I had taken no note. I couldn't stop the tears from coming to my eyes. As she spoke, images came before me, memories that I had long suppressed. I struggled to keep my composure and my tears in check, feeling as if I were the child and she the adult. But he never told me that he loved me, I thought. She replied to my thought. That doesn't mean he didn't love you. With her endearing smile, she added, Vasundarama does not speak her love for us, and yet she loves us all of us, every creature and plant, and even the stones, for they are part of her too. Earth loves us. My voice shook as I watched her hands caringly caress the ground beneath us. She nodded. Before I was born here, after I had heard Pitaji and Ma calling for me to take birth, Vasundarama appeared before me and said that she would take me to them. She said, they will love you just as I do. This is how I know her love for us, and I will be ever grateful to her for guiding me here. Her expression had softened and displayed great tenderness. She spoke these words. Then, turning to me, she placed her delicate hand on my arm and said, And I love you, Meenakshi. After speaking these precious words, she caught sight of the rabbits again and scampered off. I was deeply touched by her expression of love. Never before had I heard those words, I love you. Mata stirred something deep within me that day. Usha saw my distracted state and said quietly, Meenakshi, I will look after Mata. You can go spend some time alone. I thanked her and retreated to my room, where the tears could flow freely. I allowed myself to be the child again and cry for the father I had lost and perhaps never really appreciated. My tears were also an expression of gratitude for Mata, for the love she had expressed. All the memories of tender moments with my father returned to me, and for the first time, I felt his love. Sometime later that day, I made my way to Aditi, who was very ill and in her last days. I told her what had happened. She was in a much weakened state, but she managed to smile and whisper, "Of course, your father loved you. You were everything to him, and whatever he did, however stern he seemed, it was his way of protecting you, Meenakshi." She was quiet for a few minutes. "I believe he gave his life so you could advance in this household. Look what blessings have come upon you now. Your father's devotion and loyalty played a large role, Meenakshi. Never doubt that. His sacrifice enabled you to be in the position you now are in. His sacrifice and Janak Baba's love for him." I looked at her questioningly. She nodded. "So that is why he saved me that day in the river," I murmured. "His love for my father." "That was his love for you, Meenakshi." "For me?" I exclaimed in disbelief. Aditi sighed and gathered her strength. "Have you not noticed his love for all of us? The care he takes for everyone in the household? Despite all his responsibilities, he comes often to check on me, to see whether there is anything I need, to ask what he can do to make me more comfortable. And I am just a servant. It is beyond me to understand such love. And Rajkumari Sita has such same quality." I nodded, overcome by the emotions that were gushing up. When I could speak again, I asked, "But Aditi, how could Mata have known this pain that was long buried in my heart?" "There are many things about Mata that we will never understand. But one thing is for certain, she has brought joy to this household and to all of Mithila, such as we never had before. She exudes the love that Janak Baba has, but does not display so openly. Sometimes I think she is love itself." Aditi's voice had grown very faint, and feeling that I had tired her, I started to take my leave. But then I turned and took her hand. "You have meant a lot to me, Aditi, all these years." She smiled. When she saw the tears gathering, she said, "Do not cry for me, Meenakshi. A new chapter has begun for you, and I must continue with my journey." I knew that this would be our last conversation, so I stayed by her side, but with her eyes, she indicated it was time for me to leave, and so, internally saying my last goodbye, I let go of her hand and of another part of my past. From that day, I was healed of the pain of feeling myself an unloved child. Some years after this episode, I was to discover that I was not the only servant healed of an inner pain. Many in the household, and I dare say our kingdom, experienced healing of one sort or another from our dear beloved Mata.